Aldous Pell had worked the Crail stables for 24 years, and in all that time, he had learned one law above all others. Do not speak unless Mr. Evander Crail asks you a direct question, and do not look at him when he is thinking. He had seen the man reduce a county magistrate to silence with a glance. He had watched two rival landowners leave the Harescroft study within 10 minutes of each other, both pale, both very careful with their words for years afterward. He had heard the grooms whisper, the house staff whisper, the village whisper, and he knew, as they all knew, that Evander Crail was not a man you crossed and prospered. The man was not cruel, he was simply the weight that held the whole structure upright, and some weights feel like pressure until you understand they are the only reason the roof has not come down on everyone's head. But there was the other thing. The thing Aldous never spoke of, though he thought of it often in the quiet hours before a dawn feed. Miss Mora, Evander Crail's father's sister, 81 years old, alone in the East Wing with her books and her bird and her refusal. 11 years of silence between her and her nephew. 11 years of letters that went unanswered, and messages that returned without reply, until eventually, the letters from this side of the house had stopped too. Aldous had pieced together fragments, something said at a funeral, a matter of the will, Rennick's smooth explanations about old wounds, but he had never known the root, and no one below stairs spoke of it above a murmur. What he knew was this. On the rare evenings when Evander Crail stood at the upper window looking east, it was toward his aunt's wing, and the look on his face was not the look of a man holding a grudge, it was the look of a man standing outside a locked door, for which he no longer believed he had the key. Rennick would know, Aldous had sometimes thought. Rennick, who had arrived 3 years ago as the estate manager, who moved through the house with the ease of a man who believed he had already inherited it. The staff found him agreeable. Aldous did not find him agreeable. It was something in the way Rennick spoke of Miss Mora, always with a sigh, always with the implication that her stubbornness was beyond remedy. Something in the way he spoke of the estrangement, as though it were weather, settled, permanent, beyond anyone's help. Aldous had kept that unease to himself for 3 years, and done nothing with it. He was a head groom, it was not his place. Then the girl arrived. He noticed her first on a Tuesday morning in early October, when the mist had not yet lifted from the lower paddock. A hired car pulled into the yard, and a young woman climbed out with a canvas bag and a small leather case of medical supplies. She looked around the way a person does when braced to be unwelcome, taking in the scale of the place without flinching. She was ordinary, in the way that good things sometimes are. Not plain, not striking, simply herself, with the kind of quiet composure that does not announce itself. She asked one of the younger grooms for the kitchen entrance, thanked him when he pointed, and was gone before the car turned around. Nessa, he heard her name from the cook that afternoon, brought on in a hurry because Dr. Fail's regular assistant had fallen ill, and Miss Mora's chest had worsened overnight. A temporary posting, Rennick had made clear, only until the regular woman recovered. Aldous watched her come and go over the next 2 days. She was quiet in a house that had learned the value of quiet. She did not linger in the kitchen for gossip. She did not look for Rennick's approval, which seemed to mildly irritate him. She asked the cook for a second blanket for Miss Mora's room, was told the linen cupboard key was with the housekeeper, and fetched it herself without making it anyone else's trouble. On the second evening, crossing the back passage with the night feeds, Aldous saw her pause at the east wing door with a supper tray and say something softly through it. The old woman's voice, thin and suspicious but awake, answered. He did not hear what passed between them. He kept walking. The fever came on the third night. He knew something was wrong when he came in from the late check and found the cook still up at 11:30, hands wrapped around a cold cup of tea and her eyes on the ceiling. Miss Mora's rooms were directly above. He went to bed. There was nothing for him to do. But he did not sleep easily, and when the stable clock struck 4, he rose and went out to the yard, and stood in the cold dark, and listened. The east wing light had been on all night. What he was told afterward, piece by piece, was this. Miss Mora's temperature had climbed through the night. Nessa had sent for Dr. Fail at 10 o'clock. He had come and gone by midnight, satisfied she would likely be well by morning. What he could not give her was someone to sit with. Miss Mora, 81 years old, and frightened in the dark, in a way she would have been furious to admit, gripped Nessa's wrist when the doctor left, and did not let go. Nessa stayed. She pulled the small chair to the bedside, and sat through every hour of that long night, talking when Miss Mora wanted to talk, quiet when she did not, getting up to adjust the blankets or fetch water, or stand at the window, and narrate the more in a low, steady voice, until the old woman's breathing slowed. It was toward 3 in the morning that Nessa noticed the bureau. It sat against the east wall, an old thing, heavy dark wood, its top drawer hanging open as though left in a hurry. The habit of the nurse in her moved her to close it neatly, while Miss Mora slept. Inside, bundled with a faded ribbon, she found a packet of letters. She would not have looked further, but the top letter lay loose and folded, its fold come open, and she saw the first line. She was not the kind of woman to read someone's private correspondence, but the first line was enough to make her read the second, and by the fourth she was sitting in the small chair with the packet in both hands, and the sick, cold understanding of what she was holding, moving through her like a tide going out. They were letters written to Miss Mora, in the name of Evander Krail, but they were not from him. The hand was wrong. Aldous had seen Krail's handwriting on stable orders for 24 years, and when Nessa described the letters later, the slight backward slant, the flourish on the capital letters, he knew at once. Rennick's hand. Rennick's careful, patient construction of an elderly woman's certainty that her nephew had written to her only to assert his claims, to manage her, to wait for her to die. Miss Mora had believed for 11 years that her nephew had never truly wanted her forgiveness, that every letter from his side of the house had been, at its core, a letter about the estate. None of those letters had been from him at all. When the fever broke just before 5 o'clock, and Miss Mora opened her eyes and found the young woman still there, still in the small chair, still present, the packet of letters now set quietly on the bureau top, she was still for a long moment. Then she said one word. She said his name. Not as a question, not in anger, just his name. The way you say a word when you have been holding it back so long that letting it go is the whole of what you have left. Nessa was down the passage before the light had fully changed. Aldous was in the stable yard when the east wing door opened, and she came across the cobbles toward him, her coat over her indoor dress, her face carrying the look of someone who has been awake all night, holding something very carefully, and has not yet set it down. He started to say something about the horses. She stopped him with a look, not rude, just the look of a woman who had no time for the preamble, and said, "Where will he be? This early?" "The North Study," Aldous said. "He's up by 5. She nodded once and went back inside. He stood in the yard and waited, though he could not have said for what. He heard it 40 minutes later from the cook, who had heard it from the parlor maid. Evander Krail had come out of the North Study, stood in the hall without moving for a long moment, then gone to the east wing himself, for the first time in 11 years. The door of Miss Mora's room had closed behind him, and no one had heard anything through it, and no one had tried. What Aldous saw for himself came later that morning. He was crossing the lower yard when he heard footsteps on the gravel and looked up to see Evander Krail walking toward the stables, not to speak to Aldous, but with the bearing of a man who needed open air and ground under his feet, and the plain company of horses. He stopped at the paddock gate and stood with his arms on the top rail, looking at nothing, and Aldous gave him his distance and went on about his work. After a while Krail said, without turning, "The young woman, the nurse companion, is she to go back to the agency?" "I couldn't say, sir," Aldous said. "Rennick engaged her." "Rennick," Krail said, very quietly, in a tone that told Aldous everything about the solicitors' meeting that would happen before the week was out, "is no longer in a position to engage anyone." Aldous kept his eyes on his work. "Yes, sir." There was a long silence. The horses moved. The mist was lifting off the lower field. "She sat with my aunt through the night," Krail said. It was not a question. "So I understand, sir." Another silence. Then, "She didn't ask anything of anyone?" "No, sir." He said nothing else. He stood at the paddock rail a few minutes longer, then walked back to the house with the same measured, unhurried stride he always carried, and Aldous did not see him again that morning. The week that followed was the silence of things being set right. Rennick's departure was orderly and final, handled through the solicitors, the forged letters logged and documented in language that would follow him wherever he went. The cook said he had left without saying goodbye to anyone. Miss Mora was on her feet by Friday. On Saturday she came downstairs for the first time, slowly, with Nessa at her elbow, and sat in the small parlor with a cup of tea and her nephew across from her. And no one who worked in the house walked through that end of the corridor unnecessarily. Aldous did not see what passed between them. He heard the cook describe the sound of voices from behind the parlor door, just voices, steady and unhurried, and he thought of 11 years, and of all the letters that had never arrived, and he found himself grateful in the way of a man who has spent a long time watching a wrong thing persist, and has not known how to stop it. He found out about the gatehouse the following week. The cook told him. Evander Krail had sent for the estate carpenter and 2 men from the village, and by the end of the week, the gatehouse cottage, empty for 7 years, its frames gone gray, and its garden gone to seed, had been put in proper order. New glass, new paint, the range cleaned and lit, the stone flags scrubbed, the garden cleared to its good bones. Nessa had been asked nothing about it and consulted on nothing. She found the deed on the kitchen table one morning, a single folded document with her name on the outside, in a hand she recognized from the stable orders she had seen in the yard. Signed, dated, no condition written anywhere in it. The cook said she had stood holding it for a long time without speaking. Aldous understood that. There are some things that come to you so cleanly, the whole weight of a life spent in hired rooms and temporary postings, and then a door, unlocked, with no one standing behind it asking what you plan to do with it. She stayed. She was simply there, at Miss Mora's elbow in the morning, in the kitchen at mealtimes, in the gatehouse garden in the dry afternoons, with a trowel and gloves. She and the old woman took on the habit of the lower corridor walk together, and sometimes Evander Krail joined them, and sometimes he did not. Aldous gathered from these small evidences that the arrangement was becoming what it would eventually be, the slow, unhurried kind of thing that does not announce itself but simply persists, the way good things do. She was simply there, at Miss Mora's elbow in the morning, in the kitchen at mealtimes, in the gatehouse garden on the dry afternoons with a trowel and a pair of gloves. She and the old woman had taken on the habit of the lower corridor walk together, and sometimes Evander Krail joined them, and sometimes he did not, and Aldous gathered from these small evidences that the arrangement was becoming what it would eventually be, the slow, unhurried kind of thing that does not announce itself but simply persists, the way good things do. He thought of it one morning, standing in the yard in the early light while the horses moved and the mist rolled back from the moor, the woman who had sat through the night asking for nothing, who had carried one word down a stone passage at dawn and placed it in a man's hands like a gift she had not made and could not keep. Aldous Pell was not a sentimental man. 24 years in the Krail's service had cured him of most forms of it, but he understood what it cost to hold something precious carefully through a long dark night and give it away at first light without claiming any credit. He had not known her name when she stepped out of that car in the mist. He had barely noticed her. The things you barely notice, he thought, and what they quietly do while no one is looking. He went inside to begin the morning feed, and the yard was still, and the east wing light was already on, and down the lane the gatehouse had a window open to the October air.